Today we are joined by Catherine, a project coordinator, and Madeline, a research project coordinator from the Diverse Project, a pan-Canadian research initiative focused on improving forest management. The Diverse Project seeks to enhance forest resilience to global changes while fostering sustainable forest stewardship practices. Born in Edmonton, Alberta, Catherine grew up in Vancouver, BC, where, from a very young age, she was fascinated with nature and wildlife. She returned to Edmonton to pursue a Bachelor of Science in Biology at the King's University. Her experiences as an undergraduate student further solidified her passion and interest in ecological systems and conservation, as well as her interest in research. And then our other speaker, Madeleine, as driven by a passion for climate change and social justice. Madeleine believes science not only reveals our shared vulnerabilities in a changing world, but also empowers us to make informed decisions that drive meaningful change. Madeleine holds a bachelor's degree in biology with a minor in anthropology from McGill University. Since graduating, she has been working on many initiatives as a research assistant and coordinator. Catherine, I believe you are controlling the slideshow, so if you want to start the presentation, please go ahead.
Perfect. Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us for this presentation. Me and Madeline are both very excited to be here. So like Allison just mentioned, I'm Catherine Knodel. I'm one of the research project coordinators for the Diverse Project. I'm based in Edmonton, Alberta, so I'm our Western coordinator. Madeline, you can introduce yourself too.
Yay, hi everyone. I'm Madeline and I'm joining from Montreal, where I'm the Eastern coordinator for the Diverse Project.
Perfect. So yeah, we're really excited to share about Diverse. We're really passionate about this project, and our role as coordinators is basically to make sure that all the moving pieces in the project keep happening the way they should. We're kind of like the oil in the joints of the project. So before we go into the bulk of our presentation, we thought it would be helpful to give a little bit of a background on the Diverse Project. So here you can see our map of our research sites. So as you can see, we have lots of research sites that are involved in the Diverse Project across Canada. So this research project is involving people in all sorts of different provinces. So in numbers, this project is going to be about 5 years. So it started in 2023 and is going to end in November of 2028. We have over $7.4 million of funding, which might sound like a lot, but it has to stretch really far to try because we have so much good research packed in. We have over 50 researchers that are involved in this project, around 30 graduate students. We also have some undergrad students that might be working with us as summer students. And these sites that are in yellow and in orange, or sorry, in green on this screen, there's about 22 of them. And it covers about 18 million hectares of land. So that's a lot of land. And it's over 6 provinces.
Yeah, and before we start, we know that people might be more excited to hear about animals when it comes to biology. And when we start talking about trees and plants, people think it's going to be boring. But I want to be very clear here, trees are pretty cool. And when I started as an undergrad, I was more excited by animals tracking. But then I realized trees, they don't move. And so you get to study them and build study designs with permanent plots and long-term monitoring that are very, very cool. And we'll talk a bit more about that during the presentation. And trees can live an impressive amount of time. And so find a tree, like him, befriend a tree. I think they're pretty cool. But beside, Catherine, maybe you want to talk a bit about what is a tree, because that's going to be the basic part of it, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And just like Madeline, I also didn't think trees were that interesting until I learned more about them. And so let's share what a tree is to kind of spark that excitement. So what is a tree? Madeline, what do you think of when you think of a tree?
I think about green marsh. I think about the sun. I think about woody plants. That's a bit what I think about. Big, also big trees.
Okay, yeah, awesome.
Beautiful.
So yeah, like you mentioned, the sun, like all plants, trees photosynthesize light from the sun into energy. So, and they use chloroplasts in their leaf cells. We'll talk about their leaves in a second, but yeah, the sun is definitely an important one. And every year, trees grow rings which can be seen in their trunk, which you can see on the right here with that little image. So that's how you can figure out how old the tree is if you take a tree core and look at it. Trees also have woody stems, like you mentioned, Madeline, and they're covered in bark. And the bark protects the inner layers of the tree and the parts of the tree that are delivering nutrients up and down the tree. And trees, like all other plants, have leaves, and their leaves are either in the form of needles or broadleaves. So here you can see the leaf of a maple tree and also what looks like a spruce or a conifer needles. And these leaves are the primary location of photosynthesis, where they produce sugars and energy, their food. And so that's why all those leaves are high up, so that they can reach the sun.
Nice. But just like in the animal kingdom, there are many different animal species. And so with the plants and trees, we also have many different species of trees. And each species has its own characteristic, its own traits that make it very unique. And so I want us to look at some tree traits here. So one of the first trait I'm mentioning is height. And so different species of tree will reach different heights. Another one is bark thickness. Another one we can think about is seed dispersal. And so many different species of trees will have their own seed dispersal mechanism, and we'll talk about that a little more in the presentation. Some trees also have the ability to resprout. And depending on the soil where they grow, and their species, trees will have different root systems that will reach different depth in the soil. And so I want us to think about all those tree traits as functional traits. So when you think about functional traits, it's how a species will respond to its environment. It impacts how trees live in their environment. And so if we look at the definition, it's a feature of an organism which has demonstrable links to the organism's function. To put it simply, it's a feature of a tree, because the organism here is a tree, which determines how it responds to its environment and external pressures. And so now that we know that a tree uses light to make its own food, it has woody stems, each species has its own way to respond to the environment, to its own unique functional traits. Then when all the trees hang out together, we call it a forest. But what is a forest really, Catherine?
I would love to tell you. So there's lots of different ways of defining forests, but I'm going to start off as someone with a biology background with a little bit more of a biological or ecological definition. So like I said, there's many ways to define a forest. This more biological definition is that a forest is an ecosystem composed of trees and biological diversity of many other species. So here I've included a few little images of other animals. Forests are a home for all sorts of different species, and that they're not just plants, they're also animals. There's understory plants in addition to the trees. Here I have wolves and a deer and a bear. There's going to be also fungi and bacteria, and it's a whole ecosystem of lots and lots and lots of different species. And the types of species you'll see will depend on where you are and what forest you're in. But there's also many other ways to define forests. So another way to think about them is in terms of the services that they provide. So in this case, you'd be thinking about what the forest what services they offer for us as humans or for wildlife, the ecosystem at large. And there's different ways to define these services depending on what you're thinking about and what function you're looking at. So to start off, like I mentioned before, forests are an ecosystem of trees that contain a biodiversity of species. And this means that forests function or can be defined as a habitat for wildlife, as well as understory plant species and all the other biodiversity that lives within the forest. So I wanted to include this image of a woodland caribou because caribou need forests as habitat to provide shelter from predators. And it also allows them to eat their favorite food, which grows on the bark of trees, lichen. And caribou are found in our boreal forests in Canada, northern Canada. So I thought they would be a really good example to share with you guys, as it's part of our nation and they live in our ecosystems. Another one that comes to mind, another way to define forests, is they are a source of wood. Forests are very important for our lumber industry. And we rely on the lumber industry as it's where we get things like paper or lumber building supplies for building houses, furniture. If you look around you, wherever you are, you'll probably see wood is around you and paper. We use them all the time, and they're a very essential part of our function as humans and the things we get up to. So another important function and service of forests is the socio-ecological or cultural function. Forests are beautiful spaces that we enjoy spending time in, whether it be through hiking, sightseeing, camping, or other outdoor activities. If you picture a Canadian national park, not all of them have forests, but you're likely going to be picturing a forest when you first think of a national park. We Canadians and people across the world love forests, and we love being in them. Another important function and service of forests is carbon storage. Trees deposit and take in carbon dioxide, and then they release oxygen, purifying the air that we breathe, that other species rely on, important for the whole planet. And lastly, this is similar to our socioeconomic and cultural function of forests. Forests offer a home for Indigenous peoples. As of 2011, about 70% of Indigenous communities in Canada were located in forested areas. So this is an important area for our Indigenous people. In this photo here, I thought it'd be cool to include there's some totem poles. These are typically carved out of Western red cedar among Indigenous communities in the Pacific Northwest. And they're primarily visual representations of kinship, depicting family crests and clan membership. So these totem poles, which are, you have to have a forest to be able to make them from the Western red cedar, they're a really important point of community for Indigenous peoples in the Western Canada. So this would be like in British Columbia, and I believe also up into Alaska, which is not Canada, but still important.
Yeah, but in the last decade, we've heard about forest collapse in the media. I don't know if you've heard about it or if you've noticed it, but forests around the world are facing unprecedented levels of stress. But what kind of stress are forests experiencing, right? And what is a stress for a forest or a tree? I know that I can experience stress before exams or presentations or, I don't know, sports competitions. But trees don't do that. And so, what is a stress for a tree?
Yeah, I can explain that one for us. So trees don't study for exams, as far as I know, but they have their own form of stress that they experience. So trees experience all sorts of different types of stress. Stress occurs when a physical factor has a negative impact on an ecosystem or its biotic or living components. So more simply put, in terms of trees, global stressors negatively impact trees as well as the forest they're a part of. They put the trees are stressed out. So you can think about how we get stressed out by things, trees do too, but their responses are going to be different than what we do because we're just humans and they're trees and they're very different from us. So we want to go into briefly what kinds of stresses trees and forests encounter. So first off, trees can experience stress because of low or high precipitation. When I say precipitation, that refers to rainfall or snow or hail, anything where moisture is coming down into the soil. So low precipitation can lead to drought, where there's not enough moisture in the soil, and this can damage and hurt the tree. It struggles to get oxygen and nutrients. But then on the flip side, excessively high precipitation can cause waterlogging where the soil is flooded. The trees can't get as much oxygen as they need and they can die out or their leaves will wilt. I want you to picture for this, if you have a plant at home and you don't water it, that's like drought. Your plant is probably not going to do very well or die unless you have a cactus. But most plants won't do very well. And if you overwater a plant, you also will see that it doesn't do very well and might die out because it can't get that oxygen out of that soil. Another example of a global stressor is human impacts. Like I mentioned, there's lots of services that we get from trees, and when we're using and forests, and when we're getting those services from forests, we also have an impact on them. We have a relationship with the forest. So just as forests impact us, we impact forests. So when we're hiking, when we're camping, when increases in lumber demand as the human population gets larger, these things are all impacting forests and putting stress on them. It doesn't mean that these resources are a bad thing for us to be utilizing. It's just that we need to be aware of the stressors on forests so we can manage them and take care of them long term. Another stressor is forest fires. And fires, I don't want you to think about forest fires in a negative light, because fires are actually vital, especially across Canada, and a natural part of our forests, and they shape them. But too frequently, if fire is too frequent or way more severe than forests have adapted to handle, it can damage them and prevent them from growing back. Temperature changes also impact forests. This will depend on region and species, but warmer temperatures can bring in new pests maybe that wouldn't be in that region before, that maybe a forest isn't adapted to handle, and it might damage them. If it's really hot, trees will need more water, even if it's like the same amount of precipitation, but it's really hot. Think about when you're going for a run and it's 35 degrees outside and it's really hot, you need way more water because you're sweating a ton to try and keep yourself cool in the hot weather. Trees, it's similar. They may not be sweating like us, but they're losing way more moisture. And so that's also really important for trees, and that is how temperature impacts them as well. And the last stressor I want to bring up is pests. And I just wanted to give one example of a forest pest. There's lots of different types of forest pests, whether they're insects or funguses, there's bacteria, all sorts of things, all sorts of living organisms impact forests. But the mountain pine beetle is a great example. In Western North America, mountain pine beetle feeds on lodgepole and ponderosa pine trees and can cause extensive pine mortality. And we're going to touch on mountain pine beetle a little bit more later on in the presentation. You'll see some of the damage they can do.
Mm-hmm. So prediction of global stresses allows us to manage our forests. So as Catherine mentioned, stresses occur in many different ways. You can have many different stressors, but when you're a tree, you're adapted to those stressors. You may have even adapted to the fires. And so you should survive those stressors just as we survive sports competitions. And so one thing that we have not mentioned yet, and I'm pretty sure you know about, is climate change. And so climate change is a long-term shift in the average weather conditions of a region, such as its typical temperature, rainfall, and windiness. And climate change means that the range of conditions expected in many regions will change over the coming decades. And so if we look at this definition, what it really means is that you add climate change to those stressors, and what it makes, it amplifies them. It makes them either more frequent or bigger, or that will last for a longer period of time. And so a stressor that you're adapted to for a short period of time, you might not be adapted to if you take this period and you make it twice as long or even worse. So climate change amplifies stressors that already exist and makes them less predictable. And that's a very key part of climate change, because what do we do when we can't predict stressors anymore? We now have to manage our forest with a great deal of uncertainty. And this is the scary part, but it's also a part where we need to change our way to think about where we manage our forest and how we do it. And so that's where we come in as the Diverse Project. This is one of the things that we're doing. How do we make sure forests will keep their functions in the long run? This is one of the key questions that we're trying to address with our research. Also, something else is, how do we make Canadian forest resilient in the face of such uncertainty, in the face of, yes, climate change, but we mentioned so many other stressors that are now less predictable. So how do we go from managing and controlling to trying to manage for something that we don't know? So this is one of the key things we're addressing in our project. But before we move on, there is one word that will keep coming up during the presentation that I want us to define, and it's resilience. What is resilience?
Yeah, so resilience of an ecosystem is its ability or capacity to absorb the environmental changes and resist to disturbances without changing its functions. So we have these functions here. You can see like that image of the ungulate of, sorry, that's a more technical term than maybe I should be using, the caribou. That's a function. The forests need to maintain that. A forest that can maintain its function by maintaining a habitat for caribou, that's a resilient forest. A forest that we're still able to get lumber from, that's a resilient forest. A forest that is still able to capture carbon and release oxygen, that's a resilient forest. So if you're a bit confused still, like this little chicken we put on the screen, let's look at an example. So here we have a forest stand. It's mostly conifers trees. And then let's bring in a disturbance like fire, which was one of the stressors that we mentioned. If there's a fire or any other stressors, this is going to impact the forest. So consider this scenario. This forest looks the same as it was before. So it goes through the fire and it looks the same composition, same types of conifer trees. We would call this forest resilient because it resisted the stressor and remains the same. And this could have occurred because the stressor was relatively small. But then if we look at this example, say the forest burns and we result in this type of forest afterwards. This is still a coniferous dominant forest, and the forest still remains. It's still able to offer the functions of a forest. And so we would also consider this to have been a resilient forest. It made it through the fire. Here, in our project, we would also define this example as a resilient forest. You have now more deciduous trees that grew back after the fire, but it's still a forest, and so it still provides the functions of a forest, and it's still resilient. But what happens when no trees come back? So here, this would not be considered a resilient forest. If the forest ecosystem collapses after the stressor and doesn't come back, we would say it's not resilient. So this is hard to picture, isn't it? Like, why wouldn't a forest grow back? Trees just need water and soil to grow, right? And the sun. So Madeline, do you want to talk about how that happens?
Yeah. So sometimes you have instances where the forest will not be able to come back. And so I want us to picture an example here that we have in Canada with the pine forests in Western Canada. We discussed the pine beetle at first as like a stressor. And so this past now, because of climate change and winters that are shorter or less cold, they don't die over winter. And so it amplifies this stressor, it amplifies this epidemic. And so now pine forests in Canada are at risk, high risk of collapse. It's not to say that they have already collapsed, but it's really on this verge of like, will this ecosystem be able to come back or not? Another example is the black spruce forest in northern Quebec. The black spruce has evolved with fire, and so another stressor that is natural. They've evolved together so that they reproduce after a disturbance, but they can get it can get a bit tricky because now fires are over larger areas, but also in shorter time periods. And so if you had a fire, a big fire every 25 years before, now maybe you will get two important fires in the same region in 12 years of difference. And so this black spruce doesn't have enough time to regrow and go until its reproductive maturity. And so I think this can cause a collapse in the black spruce forest in northern Quebec as well. So those are examples of ecosystems that were well adapted to certain stressors, but now that we amplify those stressors, they are susceptible to not come back and to become non-forested areas, at least for some parts of those forests. And so this comes back to our question, how do we make sure forests remain forest? We don't want to lose forested land, and we want their forests to be able to keep functioning. And how do we manage resilient forest in the face of such uncertainty? And so to include that, we are trying to think about how to diversify and how to have a maximum of function in our forest. Because as I mentioned before, every tree every tree species has its own unique way to respond to different challenges. And so I want us to think about trade-offs. So if you're thinking about trade-offs, I will give you an example that is relatable to you first. But in biology, trade-off exists when one trait cannot increase without a decrease in another, or vice versa. So an example for you would be, we are Saturday morning, and you have 3 exams coming up on Monday. You don't have enough time to get A's in all 3 tests. Like, it's either you will get B's in all 3 tests, or you will get an A in one test and C's in the 2 others. This is a trade-off because you don't have enough energy, enough resources to be able to do it all, you know? So there's an expression, we call it, you can't have your cake and eat it too. And so what you choose to do will depend on your own unique way, unique stresses and needs. And so this is what would be a trade-off. And trees also experience trade-offs.
Yes, they do. So just like how trees also experience stress like we do, and they experience it in a different way, trees also experience trade-offs. So trees have adapted over time to develop traits in response to specific stressors, and this has resulted in trade-offs. And different tree species have adapted with different trade-offs depending on the situations they've found themselves over time as they've evolved and adapted to different stressors and situations. So we want to start off with an example of some trade-offs in 3 different tree species. So here we have an aspen tree, an oak tree, and a pine tree. And we're going to talk about specifically their seed dispersal, which if you remember way back when we were talking about functional traits, Madeline mentioned seed dispersal as one of those traits. So we're going to talk about the trade-offs of different adaptations or systems that these trees have. So aspen trees produce many, many smaller seeds every year when they reproduce. So this is the strength in numbers approach. So they're light because they're small. There's lots and lots of them. They spread very far. Oak trees produce fewer seeds. They produce acorns. So you see in the little clip art I included there, little acorn. They're way bigger than aspen seeds. They're packed full of nutrients, but because they're heavier, they may not travel as far as the aspen seeds. And then you have jack pine trees. This is our conifer tree. And jack pine trees only release their seed after a disturbance or a stressor like a fire or a drought. So our other 2 tree species, the oak and aspen, they release their seeds about every year. Jack pines are more selective and they wait until something like a forest fire or a drought has happened before they release their seed. So each of these seed traits of these different species have trade-offs. There's a benefit, but there's also a possible negative depending on the situation. So aspen tree seeds have less nutrients because they're smaller, and so they may not survive a harsh winter because of that, but they can travel farther, and there is more of them, way more aspen seeds. So this increases their chances of finding a safe place to germinate because they can travel far. Maybe if the mother tree that they're coming from, that region is dealing with a severe drought or super, super cold conditions or something, because those seeds were able to travel far and get far away in that situation, those seeds would still be able to germinate, and that would still be a successful case of the tree reproducing and having more trees develop. So that's one example. Oak tree seeds are larger, like I mentioned, the acorns, and have more nutrients to survive a harsh winter. So if say that like across a really large region, there's a drought. The aspen seeds, they might not be able to germinate anywhere. They might not be able to travel far enough, even if they're traveling as far as possible because they're really light. But the oak tree seeds, they have more nutrients. And in that case, even if they're only traveling less far, because they have all that nutrients, they can handle that really severe condition. But in the situation, like I mentioned, with an aspen tree, where if the area is if it's just the local area that's struggling with something, maybe if it's severe enough, the oak tree seed might not survive anyway. So this is a trade-off between those 2 traits. And then with the jack pine trees that only release seeds after a disturbance, like a fire or a drought, this reduces their opportunities to reproduce. They're not reproducing every single year, but they save energy by only spending their energy developing seed after harsh conditions have passed. Basically, they're going, I'm going to only produce seed and try and reproduce after something bad's happened, because the chances are we'll have a more peaceful period after that. So they're really just expending their energy and trying to be more efficient about when they reproduce. So all these traits have trade-offs. There's benefits and costs depending on the situation, and these trees have adapted to have these characteristics based on which trait was more beneficial for them.
And so if we think about each species of trees having their own trade-offs and having their own responses to different stress, then it would mean that we need many different species of trees, and we need a redundancy of functions. And so if, for example, we only have one species of trees in our forest that will resist a drought, if this species specifically doesn't resist a fire and there is a fire, then we lose this ability in the forest to resist to this stressor. And so we need a diversity of functions and a redundancy, many species with the same functions, but also many species with different functions. And so this is something that we could call functional diversity. And so I want you to remember what I said at the beginning about functional traits. So each species have their own unique way to respond to stress and to their environment. And so when we think about species diversity, it's just the number of species in a forest. When we think about functional diversity, we're trying to have many different species with different functions in the forest. And so we'll look at an example. One of the functional traits I mentioned was the root system. And so if you look at the image here, you see that you have two different species of trees, and the roots are in different areas of the soil. One tree has like roots that are higher up, and the other one, it's a bit deeper, which means that they don't use the same water. They don't use the same resources in the soil. And in temperate beech and oak forest, beech rooting system is less effective in exploring deep soil layers than oak. So the two species rely on different water sources in the soil. And so if a drought comes, they won't compete for the water. And why this is important is it's because if you only have the same species, a stressor comes in, and the trees will compete for the same resource. And so they might experience a higher stress level. But if you have a mixed forest and the drought comes in, then they might not experience the stressor in the same way because they won't compete as much. There is different levels of water in the soil.
Perfect. Yeah, so great example. We're going to go to another example now to kind of help you guys think about functional diversity. So here we have 4 coniferous trees. They're all fairly similar heights. They're all coniferous, which means that they're more similar in that regard. They all have needles. And so when we're thinking about functional diversity, remember Madeline mentioned we need redundancy. So a lot of the same traits in different species, but we also need lots of different traits, different functions. So lots of different species with lots of different functions and a repeat of those functions too. So if we're looking at this stand, we have 4 species, so high biodiversity, but they're all very, very similar. So we'd have a low diversity of functions. So we don't check off that part of functional diversity. We do have a high redundancy because we have 4 fairly similar species. So, you know, if one of them is more susceptible to fire, but the other one's fire resistant, one of them will still stay, but we don't have that diversity in function in the same way. So how about this stand? If you look at this stand, you have 4 different species still, but they're all of different heights, and 2 of them are deciduous and 2 of them are conifers. And so in this case, we still have the same amount of biodiversity, still have 4 species, but now you have a high diversity of functions. These are all, they're different from each other. They can all offer different functions and they'll have different traits adapted to different situations. If you think about those trade-offs we talked about, they have different trade-offs, and so different stressors will impact each tree type differently to hopefully help for a more diverse forest. But we still have a decent amount of redundancy. It might not be as high as in group A, but you have 2 conifers and 2 deciduous trees, so that's fairly redundant.
And so this brings us to talk about functional complex networks. And I want you to focus here because I think this is the most difficult concept of our presentation. After, it's going to be easy peasy. This one is the crux. It's the hardest part. So let's put our heads together. I'll try to simplify it and make it understandable as much as I can. And so functional complex networks. Let's start with the word network. So we're talking about networks of forest stand. A forest stand is a continuous community of trees, sufficiently uniform in composition, structure, age, and size. And they are quite like a little side, a uniform side that distinguish them from other adjacent forest communities. And so you have a forest stand here. And then this forest stand is in the middle of other forest stands.
Not moving. One sec.
No worries. Excellent. And so we have other forest stands that are connected through seeds dispersal. And so those forest stands are connected together. We call this a network. Why are we talking about functional complex? And so if you remember functional diversity, that's the key word. And so in those forest stands, we're trying to think, do we have high or low functional diversity in our network as a whole and in little forest stands as well? And so here I put in red the stands that have less functional diversity. As we see, we only have 1 species of trees. And one of the red, is connected to the network. So I'm less worried about the fact that it's low functional diversity in that one little pod, in that one little patch of forest, because if there is a fire and it can't resist a fire, or if there is a pest and it can't resist a pest, then it is connected through seed dispersal. And so seeds from other forest patch can come in and colonize and disperse, and we will have regrowth of forest. I'm more worried about the little patch of forest that is not connected to the rest of the network, because if there is a stressor that comes in that the tree doesn't resist and it collapses or it dies, then it's not connected to an extensive networks with other functional traits. So which trees are going to grow there after that? Maybe we won't find species that are well adapted to the new habitat after the stressor. And so what we do when we try to manage forest with functional complex networks is that we are trying to build this network so that there is functional diversity. You have many different species of trees responding to stressors. And so what we could do to improve this network is plant a new stand, plant a new patch of forest with functional diversity to link it to the one that has a very low functional diversity. What we could also do to help forest patches that are low in functional diversity, we could do assisted migration. We could bring new species and plant them, or we could do enriched plantation, and so take species that are already present in the ecosystem and bring them in this forest patch. And so in that way, we are trying to make sure that what is forest remains forest. Whichever uncertainty there is in the future, we have many different species of trees that have many different responses to stressor, and they are a bit everywhere. And so instead of controlling very specifically the nature or like forested areas, we're planting seeds quite literally and metaphorically to help the forest just manage itself and regrow with what it has, but we're trying to bring them more tools, more species, and more functions into the ecosystem. And so this is what we do in Diverse. This is what we're trying to test. We're trying to test, is this a good approach? Is this possible even to do functional complex networks? And so to try to increase functional diversity in our forests, we're doing field work and data collection. So we're going in the field, we're collecting data to make sure that we know what are those functional traits with trees. And then we're doing computer simulations. So we have like a virtual forest and virtual stressors that come in this model, a model that is very, very well developed with specific information about each tree and each stressor. And for 150 years, we run the model with stressors. So we run this virtual forest with virtual fires, pests, drought, increase in precipitation. And then after 150 years, we stop the stressors and we let the virtual forest regrow. And then we look at, is there a forest? Was this ecosystem resilient or not? And so we're doing computer simulations with different, the forest at the beginning is different. There is one where we implement functional complex networks, and there is an initial forest where we don't implement, we just do business as usual. And then we compare at the end, after 200 years, which one is better? Is it the one where we implemented an approach with functional diversity, an increase in functional diversity? Or is it better if we just do business as usual? And finally, we look at the socioeconomic analysis, because it's not possible to put that in place if there is no money, if people don't want that, if there is no social acceptability, if the laws in place don't allow us to do it. For example, if there are regulations that prohibit assisted migration, then it's not possible to do it. So we have a whole theme, a research team that is around socioeconomic analysis. And so this is what we do in Diverse. And there is one theme that is focused on silvicultural trials, and Catherine can talk a little bit more about that part of the project.
Yeah, so this is the last thing that we'll talk about on the project for our presentation. So as part of the field work that we mentioned, will be the goal of what we call our silviculture trials. So the goal will be to establish about 10 to 12 of these sites across Canada. And these sites will be managed by forestry companies who will get to have their input from their side. And this will go beyond the 5-year scope of the project. So you might be wondering, what is silviculture? Because you might not have heard that word before. So silviculture is the theory and practice of controlling the composition, growth, and quality of forest stands to achieve the objectives of management. I don't want you to worry too much about this term. It's just useful to know. I keep saying silviculture trials, so now you have a little definition of silviculture. But for our project, each silviculture trial site will include the following components in their design. So first, we'll be planting different combinations of current and future adapted species. So this is like we've talked about before with functional diversity. Having a diversity of tree species with different functions can allow our forests to be more resilient. So with that in mind, we'll be implementing this by putting in different combinations of future and adapted species. And this could be us implementing assisted migration, like Madeline mentioned earlier with the functional complex networks. And so here you'll have a different combination of different species at different sites. And each site will tailor the species it selects depending on the needs of the region that that site is in, and also depending on the needs of the partner that's involved. These traits are going to, or sorry, not traits, these sites are going to be managed by our forestry partners, so by industry. And so different companies will have different capacities to do different things. They'll have different needs. And so this is how we're incorporating their values and what they think is important and what they're able to do into our project. Because like Madeline mentioned with the socioeconomic analysis, if what we find out that we, like with functional networks and functional complex networks and functional diversity, if we come up with a game plan of what would be good for managing our forests and it's not actually achievable, then our research wasn't very useful. So the second part of these trials will be looking at different harvesting levels. So for example, this could be clear cut, where all trees are harvested at the same time, versus a partial cut, where some of them are harvested, whereas some of them are left to stand. And then you have more variety in tree ages within that forest. And so different, like each site will have a combination of different sections that have partial cutting or clear cutting, and then we can see the results and compare them. And this will be at all of the different sites, the 10 to 12 sites that we will develop. So these trials are going to be the legacy of the Diverse Project. We're putting in all the field work, the data collection, the finding out what these functional traits are, doing the computer simulations and testing out what is likely to happen in the future depending on how we manage our forests. And we do the socioeconomic analysis, all of that. But also these trials, the silviculture trials, they will be in place after the 5 years of Diverse is over. All of that other stuff we'll have done and it'll be complete and we'll close that chapter of the project. But these trials will be the legacy that continues on for decades. And these sites can be a place where students and researchers and government and industry members can all come and learn and see the results with their eyes firsthand. And we can continue asking these questions and getting information from these newly planted sites as they grow and through time. And so that's the hope of the project. That's the real end piece of the project. So thank you so much for joining us. Me and Madeline love any opportunity to talk about this project. And so if you ever need to contact us, I've included our email on the bottom of the slide. It's cut off in my view, so it might be for yours, but we can put our emails in the chat too. And you can scan the QR code on the bottom left there if you want to see our website. There's lots of great information there. But yeah, we're happy to take any questions now.